philosophies on our Christian academic responsibilities. And we come now to our responsibility to the wider society beyond the university. And this quote from Abraham Kuyper, just to remind you, has been our text or our motto for this whole series. I want to begin with a quotation from Charles Malik, who was a Christian statesman, a former president of Lebanon. He was one of the drafters of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And in a book that he wrote about 40 years ago called A Christian Critique of the University, this is what he writes. He says, the university is a clear-cut fulcrum or a lever with which to move the world. The problem here is for the church to realize that no greater service can it render both itself and the cause of the gospel with which it is entrusted than to try to recapture universities for Christ.
Vinod, are you
Yes?
trying to share your screen? It's not shared.
Okay, can you?
Yeah, no, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So this is from Charles Malik. The university is a clear-cut fulcrum, or that is a lever with which to move the world. The problem here is for the church to realize that no greater service can it render both itself and the cause of the gospel with which it is entrusted than to try to recapture universities for Christ, on whom they were all originally founded. He's thinking of European and North American universities. One of the best ways of treating the macrocosm is through the handle of the universities, in which millions of youth destined to positions of leadership spend in rigorous training between 4 and 10 years of the most formative period of their life. More potently than by any other means, change the university and you change the world. I guess it is this sort of vision that inspired many of us to get into university teaching or research and even join IFES, university ministry, because universities are the places where the ideas and ideologies are created which have an impact on the world, both for good and for evil. And many of those who emerge from our universities end up as leaders in different areas of society. Now, this may not be true today, and it's a question that we need to discuss in our different IFES movements, whether universities still play this role, especially in our region. I often tell those IFES movements that are short on resources, they have very few staff, lack of funding. Don't try to spread yourself too thinly and work in every university, but identify those lead institutions, universities that do give intellectual leadership in your society, and concentrate your attention, your resources on them. And then after some time, you might find graduates emerging who will become Christian faculty or perhaps staff workers who can work in other universities. So just by being a university researcher or a university teacher in the way that we have looked at in previous webinars, we are impacting the wider society, perhaps even the wider world. So that's what I want to say at the beginning, provided, of course, that the kind of research, the kind of teaching that we are giving actually is forming people for social responsible roles. Here are two quotations from two psychologists, the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, very famous educational psychologist who's often quoted in books on educational philosophy. He wrote, "The principal goal of education is to create men and women who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done. Men and women who are creative, inventive, discoverers, The second goal of education is to form minds which can be critical, can verify, and not always accept everything that they are offered. And remember, he was writing about school education, not just university education. Also, Barry Bercier writes, teaching students to discriminate well, to discern and judge between the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the worthy and the base, the just and the unjust, is central to the work of a university. Marilynne Robinson is a very well-known American novelist. Her novels have won lots of prizes. She's also well-known in secular. She's a Christian, but well-known in the secular realm because of her essays critiquing American society and reminding the American world of the debt that it owes Christian institutions, not least some of the universities that were founded in New England by the Christians known as the Puritans. And in one of her essays, she says, and I quote, Amherst and Andover, these are two well-known universities on the East Coast, with Yale University, became the front line in the abolitionist movement, that is the movement to abolish slavery in the 19th century. Higher education, liberal education, became a very important medium for the advancement of radical social reforms. The movement that scattered these colleges over the landscape, a very distinctive feature of American civilization, has had immeasurable consequences, including its contributions to the ultimate elimination of slavery. But what I want to do today is to go beyond just our impact through the universities on the wider world in which we live, to our impact as individuals, or perhaps a few individuals getting together to speak into public life, that is the world outside the university. These are people we call public intellectuals, and good examples are found in India. Many Indian public intellectuals in the last 50 years. Ambedkar, who started his academic life as an economist before switching to law, and who single-handedly drafted the Indian Constitution in 1950. And many of those names are known to you. They are known in the wider Indian society. They have their specialist disciplines, like Rajni Kothari is a sociologist, Ramachandra Guha is an environmental activist, but they write in secular newspapers. They are known as people who bring sound, solid thinking into public affairs. In America, perhaps the best known public intellectual has been Noam Chomsky over the last 50 years or so. He made his name in linguistics, but then became active in the 1960s while he was a professor of linguistics at MIT, one of the vocal protesters against the Vietnam War, championing the cause of the Palestinians, challenging Zionism. Today, he's one of the leading global intellectuals, socially and politically engaged, with a huge following amongst young people. Sadly, often dismissed as a communist by right-wing Christians. People like Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who has a regular column in the Washington Post on economic issues. Bill McKibben is a Christian, again, an environmental activist who writes on environmental issues, not just for Christians, but to the public, the wider public. Other Christians from an earlier age, people like Martin Luther King, Reinhold Niebuhr, these were household names. Everybody in their society recognized that they were intellectuals and they were also Christians. But why is it that there are very few Christian public intellectuals today outside of those few that I mentioned? It's a very good question for us to ask, especially those of us who belong to IFES movements that have been around for 50, 60, 70 years. How many Christian public intellectuals, that is those who are recognized as being intellectuals, as Christians who are speaking into public life, how many have emerged from our IFES movements in these last several decades? That's a very important question, we need to ask ourselves. So a Christian public intellectual is somebody who addresses public issues as opposed to just issues within the church, and does so as a Christian. And so they would be using public forums, whether it's conferences, newspapers, television interviews, social media, perhaps having their own blogs or their own websites, in order to articulate a perspective on public issues. There are also people who translate their specialist knowledge into, say, articles for lay people. Say, having a column, if you're a medical doctor, a medical scientist, having a regular column to educate people through newspapers, perhaps even on popular social media, to educate people about health, something that is so badly needed in our particular part of the world. I used to have a column in a popular English Sunday newspaper in the 1980s, even while I was working as a staff worker or general secretary for Focus, and it ran for several months, a weekly column. I was told not to write on party politics or on religion. Now that was fine, because for me, religion and politics comes into everything that you write about or speak about. But I was free to write about everything from advertising to animal welfare, you know, to the tobacco industry, to just talk about things that were happening in society that people should be aware of. A Christian public intellectual also wants to bring his or her knowledge, her specialist knowledge, in order to protect people from being cheated or exploited by people within his or her own profession. So I say to medical doctors, you should be using your medical knowledge as Christians to actually prevent ordinary people from being cheated by doctors, being given false information, being given false treatments. If you're a Christian lawyer, use your legal knowledge again to protect people from being exploited by the whole legal system, being cheated by lawyers or the police, to know their rights and to be able to stand up for those rights. I remember writing an article or several articles in newspapers in Sri Lanka in the 80s, when the Sri Lankan government was thinking of buying a nuclear reactor, a nuclear power station from an American company. And I wrote opposing it and giving reasons why, reasons that ordinary people could understand why nuclear power was not a viable and safe option for countries like ours. So that is using our professional expertise to actually challenge the lies of politicians, to protect people from vested business interests, and so on. There are some of us who are called to influence public policies by working closely with government ministries in helping to shape policies, whether it's on health or on transport or on energy or whatever. And we do this either as Christian academics or by leaving the academy and doing this full time. Now, in all this, what we are trying to do is to translate our Christian thinking, our patterns of Christian thinking, if you like, our whole Christian worldview, to translate them into language that people outside Christian circles can understand, can come to appreciate, because that is how communication takes place in a pluralist environment. You cannot just quote the Bible directly to people who don't accept the Bible as authoritative, and it also doesn't make sense to them. So this is the challenge for us. If we do become Christian public intellectuals, how do we communicate? How do we articulate our Christian perspective on the world and on specific issues in language that actually makes sense, that attracts people, that perhaps starts getting them to think and to move in new directions? Please, can you mute your microphones? Thank you. How do we communicate in public? I find that learning to ask questions, raising questions is very important, not only in our personal evangelism, but also in communicating publicly. We can begin by questioning popular language. For example, there is a language of female feticide that is very popular in India. And if you've been following my blog, I address this in my latest blog post. Discriminatory language, which is taken for granted by so many Indian Christians. So when it comes to the abortion of female fetuses, it's called female feticide, but the abortion of male fetuses is acceptable. That is discrimination. There is no equality before the law. Or think of the language that is now popular in some NGO circles. We don't want to call people disabled, but to say that they are differently able. Now, I think as Christians, we need to raise some questions. Isn't a person who is paralyzed from the neck downwards really disabled? In what way is he differently able? Why do we want to use this language? It's because, you see, we have assumed that a person's worth, their value, depends on their intellectual capacities or what they contribute to society. And we should question that assumption and say a person's value and worth does not depend on their intellectual or physical abilities, nor what they contribute to the economy, but every human being, however handicapped or disabled, carries an intrinsic value. Again, there is a whole language of developed and developing societies, the language of loving one's motherland, or who is a patriot, who is unpatriotic, the language of being a strong leader, and so on. Now, this is popular language in our societies, and just by raising a question in a newspaper article or in a public forum, we can provoke a conversation that actually takes people, in new directions. We should also question common assumptions in our cultures, our societies. For example, it's very common to hear people talking about, being faced with a choice of, do we care for creation, the non-human creation, or do we tackle poverty? And I think we need to explore that assumption and say maybe it's a false either or. It's not an either or. And maybe we need to come up with policies that actually, if they care for creation, are also alleviating poverty, because the poor are the ones who suffer most from environmental degradation. There is a very common assumption that when we speak of imperialism or colonialism, we are only talking about what Western powers have done. But some of the worst forms of imperialism actually are Asian. Think of Genghis Khan and the Mongols, perhaps the most brutal empire that the world has ever seen. Or think of Japanese imperialism in the 20th century. Or think of many Hindu kingdoms, even Buddhist kingdoms, which in ancient time were imperialistic, or the Mughal Empire, or whatever. So we need to question these common assumptions. It's very common to hear people saying that somehow any conversion is unethical. Well, question that. Why? Do the poor have no agency? Are they all easily duped? Raise those questions. What is the purpose of business? Many people in our societies, many business people assume that the purpose of business is to make money. Now, certainly you have to make money, you have to have profits, otherwise the businesses collapse. But is that the only purpose or even the main purpose of a business enterprise? Isn't it to produce goods and provide services that are really needed by people? So this whole concept of corporate social responsibility, is this a way of diverting public attention from the core activities of a company? We need to raise that question. It's not accidental that the tobacco companies sometimes have large CSR projects which they heavily advertise in order to divert attention from the harm that they're doing through their core business activities. So we should learn, as we engage in the public square, to question some of these common assumptions and see where they lead. Then we're also called to identify and critique the dominant ideologies and the idols in our society. What is our society organized around? What are the God substitutes that dominate our society? But that's what an idol is. And learning to identify idols in a particular culture or subculture is a very important part of our Christian engagement. And often identifying idols in a society can best be done through stories, because this is what Jesus did. If you read the ministry of Jesus and the way that he used parables to awaken people, to get them to see that really they were following a path that led away from God, even though they thought they were being very religious. And the two most popular stories that Jesus told, they're universally popular. In my experience, many non-Christians, secular people, Hindus, Buddhists, whatever, really love those two stories because they engage their imagination. The two stories are the parable of the lost son and the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because if you think about it, those two stories strike at the heart of many cultures. And that's why people can resonate with them. Many people can identify with the elder son in the parable of the lost son. Here is somebody who has served his father loyally, faithfully all his life, lived a decent, upright life, and yet is not treated as well as this wastrel, this man who goes and wastes his father's money on, reckless, immoral living. That's shocking. It turns the values, the religious values of our societies upside down. And then you think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, in all cultures, we are taught to value and to love those people who are like us, our family, our ethnic group, those who belong to our particular culture, our nation state, and to treat outsiders differently. And yet Jesus tells a story of an outsider, a foreigner, who actually treats us better, more justly, more lovingly than people in our own kinship group, our own nation state. And so again, that challenges a fundamental value in many cultures, whether they are Asian or African or Western. And so we need to learn to tell those stories, or modern equivalents of those stories, translate those stories into paradigms that communicate what is actually idolatrous in our particular societies. And once you have developed a reputation as a public intellectual who is Christian, I think you can be more bold in explicitly even bringing the Bible into your writing and speaking. That is what I have found, especially in South Asia, where there is a lot of respect for the Bible amongst non-Christians. Even though they may not read it, they expect a Christian to use the Bible, to quote from the Bible. And there are things in the Bible that they can resonate with. So why is it, I often wonder, that if a Christian academic is known as a devout Buddhist, we expect that person to actually sometimes quote Buddhist scriptures. If an academic, a professor, is known as a Marxist, we expect him to use sometimes Marxist arguments. We may not agree, but we understand. So why is it that Christian professors and lecturers are often afraid, too timid to bring the Bible and Christian theology into public conversations? But like I said, that can be done only after one has earned a certain respect as somebody who isn't just trying to push your ideas on people by preaching at them. And the most fundamental question that we should be asking in all societies is the question, what kind of society do we want for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren? That is the most important question that we can ask in any given society. So if I were to say, I want to live in a society where every human being from conception to the grave, to old age and the grave, is valued equally for who they are. Now, if that's the kind of society I want, then we work out, and others agree with me, then we work out, then what are the implications in the areas of education. What kind of educational system should we be designing so that every child born in this society has an opportunity to develop to his or her potential? How can we address the accidents of birth by mitigating the effects of birth on people's life chances? And the same we do for healthcare. If we take the media, if we say that each person is valuable, then why not challenge the biases of the media that are biased towards people from certain religious or ethnic communities? So the implications for public policy are immense. And they all start with this simple fundamental questions that Christians should be raising in every conversation out there in their places of work. What kind of society do we want to leave for our children, for posterity? Now, in closing, let me try to identify what are some of the barriers. Why is it, like I said, we have so few Christian public intellectuals? Well, one is we are put off by the bad examples that we see. There are Christians, the moment they try to speak in public as Christians, they think that the way that they should witness is by preaching at people, trying to convert people. And like I said, often quoting the Bible in ways that don't communicate. There are sadly Christians, when they write articles in newspapers, resort to insults, write in ways that are insensitive to people with other ideologies and worldviews, even practicing libel. They can sometimes be rude in the language they use. But I don't think that just those bad examples are a good reason why we should stay away. Sometimes we are reluctant because we have nothing distinctive to say. You know, our Christian study, our Christian reading has not kept pace with our academic or professional progress. So we are not able to think and articulate intelligently a Christian position without using Christian jargon. Then we're also fearful of criticism. But I mean, universities should be places where we entertain criticism, where we invite argument. And Christians should be the first to present a viewpoint and then invite people to tear it down, to say why they disagree. So we should be giving the lead both within the university and outside the university in encouraging mutual criticism. Well, there's also the fear of simply being different. After all, we are a minority, often a very tiny minority, and often there is hostility towards Christians, especially Christians who try to speak in public because of, like I said, the bad examples of the past and perhaps even in the present. But they should not intimidate us. We should try to overcome our timidity. Sometimes people say they're shy. My wife, Karin, used to tell people who said, oh, we are too shy to speak out. She would say, actually, shyness is a form of selfishness because you care more about what other people may think of you and say of you than what God thinks of you. And surely what God thinks of us should be paramount. And if we are secure in the love of God, we know that we are loved undeservedly and unconditionally by God. And that is where our basic security comes from. Then we can risk our reputations in saying and doing things that may be unpopular. And I think some of that timidity is often unfounded. I have engaged in public dialogue events and debates in universities in many parts of the world. I've often gone feeling rather very fearful, especially because the professor I'm engaging in dialogue with is an expert in his field, whereas I'm not. I'm just a generalist, a layperson. And there's also that hostility to Christian theology or Christian viewpoints. And often I've been pleasantly surprised, where people have shown an eagerness to listen when they're presented with a view that is profoundly theological and yet which also attracts them, makes sense to them. And I've had the experience where sometimes a person will talk with me afterwards, after the event, and say, you know, I actually was brought up in a Christian household, or I went to a Christian school, and I know that a lot of my thinking has been shaped by Christian moral values. And yet they've been afraid to say that openly. And yet the experience of being in dialogue or debating with a Christian has reminded them of that past and brought it out to the surface. So I think that when we engage as public intellectuals, we might find that many people come out of the woodwork and actually are willing to identify with us and work with us, whether or not they call themselves Christians. So thank you.
We will now have some responses to what Vinod has said, not just maybe today, but over the last 3 months as well. Satish will invite the first person to speak.
Yeah. Thank you, Vinod, for sharing, and especially as you concluded, I think that was really encouraging that you also go to speak with a lot of fear within, so to know that it is very much part of all of us, and yet how the Lord really strengthens you to stand and speak. And of course, we have all been encouraged by you. This evening, we will be hearing from few of the faculty members, especially sort of responding to that question that you brought in very strongly. What kind of society do we want for ourselves and for our future generation? And I think that was very, very strong. The first person who would respond for us is Dr. Neelanjana. Neelanjana, can you unmute yourself as well as put on your video? And Neelanjana?
Yeah, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Neelanjana. Nice to have you here, and I'm meeting you after a long time. By the way, Dr. Neelanjana is an associate professor at the National Institute of Fashion Technology, Bangalore. She has completed her PhD from IIT Delhi, and that's where our journey began. And right now in Bangalore, we are missing you. But Neelanjana, as we were discussing today, you as a faculty member in NIFT have actually brought in changes in the curriculum so that the discipline in itself is not just for the sake of teaching, but also looking at the social situations and also changing the curriculum so that we address these social situations. Can you share a little bit on your experiences?
Thank you so much, Satish Bhaiya. I'm glad to be here. And I have listened to Vinod and his challenging, Dr. Vinod and his challenging thoughts as a student in IIT itself in Delhi when he has encouraged, challenges many times. What are we going to use our technology for? From when I joined a design institute, and which is known as the National Institute of Fashion Technology, I wondered why God has brought me here. Because I knew, being a textile technologist, fashion is not the area that maybe I would like to work. And I knew NIFT more in terms of design. But when I joined there, of course, we have management and technology and design, the 3 areas we work. And the journey began because we had to do design projects with students. My interactions with ISAF, my interactions with certain Christian angels like Ashish, challenged me that even in the area of textile clothing or anything or natural fibers, there is so much that we can do for the society. So as I put forward certain questions in the classroom, that would you be interested in working with an NGO and design something for people who need it, whether it's a communication design or whether it's a different clothing for people who are sensitive to the skin. I got wonderful responses from students. And this is back in 2009 when we started working. And it was easy for me to actually do a research to see some of these NGOs where I knew people. But then
Neelanjana, earlier, Vinod brought this quote saying, teaching students to discriminate well. to discern and judge between the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the worthy and the base, the just and the unjust, is central to the work of the university. And how far do you think you have been able to take up this challenge among your students? Do you think there has been a change in their mindset? Yeah.
Satish, yes, but very few maybe. In the classroom who respond, because there is a tendency to go along with the peers, what the peers think.
Yeah.
And even among us as a faculty, when we are very careful in presenting in the classroom our Christian viewpoints, I think it's more among the students to, if they want to be different from the group. So, but then there are students who take a stand and who want to, who say, yes, ma'am, though I'm in this field, I feel this is not the right practice that we do specifically in the context of fashion or the way we, the consumerism, the way we make. And day by day, yes, there are more students who are bold. Some people, some of my students, they go out and they talk. They don't talk in a classroom, but they feel more challenged or they think outside a classroom.
Thank you so much, Nilanjana. I know it's the last minute that we asked you to be with us and speak, but before you leave, Vinod, you have something to share to Nilanjana.
Not particularly. I'm just encouraged to hear these stories, and I'm sorry I can't remember you from IIT Delhi. But that's an encouragement to me that, that something that I said actually did help you in your journey as a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We would go into the next person, a very, very young person who, in fact, was a little fearful of speaking to us, but she's someone who is a person who is going to be a person of influence in the making, and has already started writing. Aplang, can you join us? Hi, Aplang.
Hello. Hi.
Can you,
brother.
Yeah, can you put on your video?
Yeah, I put on my video. I think it's loading because of my poor connection.
Yeah, that's fine. Aplang is teaching economics in Arunachal Pradesh, and we have been friends for long. And Aplang, recently you wrote an article where you brought in the whole aspect of algorithms being very sexist, and that was really an eye-opener for me to read and understand that there's a lot of biases that can come in, even for the way that data is being taken in, and how that data is based on which there are a lot of decisions being taken. And when you have this bias of women not working or not seen, or that data not being fed into the algorithms, it actually has its impacts of the decisions that are going to be taken into the future. I want you to just, as an economist, why did you respond to this? And I want to hear a little bit more. Yeah.
Thank you, brother. I'm a little bit nervous, and I don't think I would. So, the article that was written, so it was a co-authored article, and so we were trying to look at from an economic perspective and from the perspective of technological. My co-author, she is from technology background, and I'm from economist, and that's how we decided to work together. And even I was also not aware of how algorithms can be very biased and can be very sexist. But as we were exploring, as we're reading, then we came to know that algorithms can be very biased, because most of the person who are in the technological fields, those are mainly, majority of them are men, and algorithm is made by humans, and most of them, particularly those who are working there, are men, and that biasness, the existing bias, can be reflected in the way algorithm is being created. And of course, many of the and then even that it has been this this biasness has been reflected in the way the Facebook has shown advertisement to the women. Like, women are, I don't exactly remember the figure now, but they are very, very, very less likely to receive an advertisement of a higher income job. So that's how even the Facebook has also shown biasness towards women. And even it has also an effect on the credit lending facilities. Like, it was reflected even by the Apple company, that even the Apple company also, like, it was reported that women having a higher credit score, but he has a higher credit, the women having a higher credit score are getting less amount of credit. So, and then it meant, even though they have a very less credit score, but they are getting higher amount of loan. So that's how the biasness has been reflected. And this is basically because there is also a very much gender data gap. I mean, huge gender data gap in the all over the world. So that is
Apilang,
also one of the problems.
yeah.
Yeah.
Apilang, you have been writing a lot, and thank you so much. And I think into the coming years, we are going to hear you more and more. But why is it that as a faculty who could be just happy and content teaching students and then taking a Bible study, you are moving away from that and saying that you have a responsibility to the society at large by writing, at least to start off with? What is that paradigm that has taken you out of the way in which people are already functioning?
For me, I think if I share, then it has to do with the teachings of UESI. I think it was in the year 2017. We had a program in UESI Veritas in New Delhi, and it was in that moment, it was in that program that I was made to realize the importance of writings and be a whistle blowers in the society. And then there we made a commitment that at least at least to write an article for quarterly, at least once in 3 months. And since then, I have been trying to live out that commitments, and that is the yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question? Where was this article of yours written, published?
It is in the WordPress, RLTP WordPress blog.
WordPress blog. Okay, thank you.
I have it. I will share it.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, it's good if you can write such articles. This is a very important topic that you have raised, and write it in, say, send it to newspapers. If you can translate it into regional languages, even better than doing it in English.
Okay, thank you.
It's a very important issue.
Savitri, over to you. Yeah.
I just shared the link to Apilang's WordPress article. So we have Dinesha, who is no stranger to this webinar participant group. She's Dinesha Samararatna, and she is a lecturer at the Colombo Law Faculty. And she's on leave right now, working on a postdoctoral fellowship with Melbourne University. I remember a conversation with Dinesha some time ago when she just had begun her teaching career. And we were talking about this whole calling to be a teacher that influences. So I think we agreed earlier that your responsibility to society begins with the calling to teach at the university, and the influence you have in the formation of students, what Vinod just called when you question popular technology, or when you question popular assumptions, or dominant ideologies and the idols of the younger generation. So Dinesha, what I would like you to share with us is, as a young lecturer, not yet having made like a big mark, either as a law lecturer or in the university or even in like society, what did you do and how were you in terms of who you were in order to take forward this calling to be part of the formation of your students?
Thank you, Savitri. Let me also begin by thanking Vinod for today's talk, but also for this entire series. I mean, like with the case of Nilanjana, I too have benefited from Vinod's teaching and engagement with him over the years, both as a student and beyond. So thank you for that, Vinod. To answer your question, Savitri, I think my focus has always been to encourage students to think for themselves, because as a student myself, that's what I found to be the most fulfilling experience in the classroom. And I have tried different methods in encouraging students to think for themselves. So one of the things that I started pushing my students to do was to read for class. So I would ask them to, I would direct them to some kind of reading and tell them that the following lecture will be based on that reading. So that does two things. One is it encourages students to snap out of the rote learning mentality, which is quite common in Sri Lanka. In some ways, I think it also levels the playing field to some extent in the classroom. Very often, culturally, the teacher is seen as someone who's on a pedestal, someone who knows more, and someone who has the final authority in the classroom, if not all the authority. But when you give students something to read beforehand and come to class with some advanced knowledge, then they should feel like they too have something to say about what is being discussed in class. But of course, I mean, I've been a student myself. It's not easy to get students to read before class. And as a younger lecturer, I have tried different methods, some of which I will continue to practice, some of which I may not continue to practice. But it takes a lot of effort. At the law faculty, we still use the academic year. So thankfully, I have several months over which I can work with my students, get to know them, so I can at some point estimate as to who has done the reading and who has not done the reading, but also more importantly, show them the benefits of doing that reading. Show them the benefits of engaging with me, asking me follow-up questions, disagreeing with me. And even if they struggle with me in university, one of the good things about this process has been for me that after they leave school, after they leave university, and when I meet them in their world of work, very often they come back with positive feedback and told me that they found that experience to be formative. I can see Sanjan saying something.
Thank you. I have another question. Do you want to pick up Sanjan's question?
It's not a question, it's a comment about how they've tried to avoid me checking if they have completed the reading.
Yeah. I have another question for you, and that is, when you were at uni and studying, lecturers would have used some methodologies of teaching, of trying to influence your thinking. what in your mind, with the current generation, with the students of today and tomorrow, do you think something should change in the way academics approach their teaching in order to have that, like in the time of Jesus told stories in order to communicate truth? Would you, or to actually unlearn the things that people had internalized? So he shocked them with their stories. Would you say that you have thought about this area at all?
I have. One of my earliest encounters with this challenge was in relation to technology. I myself became smartphone savvy quite recently, but I would always request students not to use the phone in the classroom because I felt that that distracted them from what was happening in the classroom. So I personally consider the classroom as a sacred space. That's where I have, or I can demand the monopoly of the student's attention. And again, as a student, I used to remember that if what was going on was not interesting, I would switch off. When I was a student, phones were not as attractive, but we would amuse ourselves doing other things. So I have always tried to be attentive to what would distract students while they were with me in the classroom. And as much as possible, encourage them to realize that it was a distraction, and sometimes used my authority to eliminate that distraction. So that's one, but at a more substantial level, there are several points, but one that I would like to mention is that I feel that increasingly, well, I don't want to say increasingly, I have a sense that students have a very utilitarian attitude to education. And some of the messages that they get from the higher education sector doesn't help the cause either. So the message that they get is that education is for your self-advancement, and that self-advancement is understood in the narrowest possible sense. Often understood in terms of the money that you will earn per month. So then trying to encourage them to think differently about what self-advancement means. Trying to encourage them to understand that my self-advancement in the sense of human flourishing, for instance, would necessarily involve the flourishing of society around me. Those are difficult, almost uphill tasks. And to encourage students also to think in terms of thinking outside the box, thinking in terms of taking risks, thinking in terms of thinking beyond the grades that they would get at the end of that subject. So those are some of the challenges I think that I have tried to face and encourage students to, like you said, learn to unlearn in that process.
Thank you. I have a question that comes out of what you said, in that I think many of our Christian lecturers, academics, try to break the cultural norm of putting the lecturer on a pedestal. I want to take that same idea. Now, I can see from the chat that my sister is saying that she did the reverse of what you did in trying to get students. She got them to Google answers and come up with answers, and which I presume then she later unpacked together. So I just want to put to all of you, not just to Dinesha, and I want to leave it as a question. I think teachers, whether school teachers or academia, in our part of the world have a lot of social space. If there is a community meeting on an issue of water or anything, and a teacher or a doctor stands up and gives their 2 cents worth about how that issue should be
Savitri, you're muted. Savitri, you're muted.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah. Just few seconds.
My question is not just for Dinesha. Thank you, Dinesha. But I have a question for all the academics here, and I want to pick it up from something that Dinesha said, that Christian academics generally try to undermine the putting on the pedestal of lecturers by students, which is the cultural norm in our part of the world. But I want to say teachers and university lecturers have a lot of social space in South Asia. And if you were to stand up at a community meeting on any issue and speak, you would be heard in a way that others may not be given a hearing. And so my question to academics, I think, is that how do you use that space in your communities and in society in general? But I'm going to ask Satish to invite the person to respond before we take questions from everyone.
Yeah. May I ask Vio, Dr. Vio Pu, who is teaching literature in Delhi University. I'm trying to share the screen. I hope it has come. Has it come? No.
Yeah. It has come.
Yeah.
It has come.
Yeah. Thank you, Vio, for joining us. And you have been with us through this entire webinar. We want to hear from you on your book. Congratulations for this new book. This is your second book that you have authored. And even as I read through the reviews, I realized that you're addressing not only the issues back in among the Naga people, of the problems between the groups that are fighting the army, or even the what are the other groups, but you're also discussing in this book about the fear of a person who wants to come out of probably the Northeast into the mainland and would still face prejudice and racism, right? So you are addressing some of the issues of the society through this new book. So share a little bit about your book and how you as a faculty, you're trying to use this medium of writing, especially stories and otherwise, to bring up the issues of the society.
Thank you, Satish Bhaiya. And it's a privilege to be able to listen to Vinod over the last 3 and today the 4th one. And of course, following Vinod has been quite a learning for people like me. And I'm sure many of us are quite blessed to read his blogs. So to the question which Satish Bhaiya just mentioned, as a person who takes interest in literature, particularly because my focus area is also the Northeast. And that is also because India is too big a country to actually take it as a whole at a time. And many areas, regions have different areas to actually explore and focus on. So for me, it has been reading literature from the Northeast has been quite enlightening and at the same time eye-opening. And as even though when I wrote this a few years back, you know, I didn't have so much in mind when I think about my responsibility to the society as such. I was looking at it as more of a therapeutic experience, writing it something which has been in my mind for a long time. But I think I'm sure my writings would resonate with many people who have gone through a lot of issues that the Northeast face even today. Of course, each region has different issues, but what I try to address here is also one that there are lots of events that happen in the Northeast which have not been addressed. Now, for example, this book is, you know, focused on an incident that happened in 1987, which is called the Wainam incident, or which immediately followed after that was the launching of the Operation Bluebird by Indian Army. And it is interesting because it has a parallel in New Delhi, you know, a few years before that, you know, the Delhi riots and the Operation Blue Star. So you have two things which are similar and yet happening at different poles of the country. And so the narrative goes on to actually pick on many other conflicts that got entangled in this issue, not just the Naga national movement, but the ethnic conflict. I was looking at a little bit about the Kuki and the Naga conflict, how all those things are merged into one. And as my character moves away from that region into a place which is called Man Lane, Delhi, and studied in Delhi University, which is not quite me, but yes, a lot of me is there. You see a lot of prejudices, racism that is from other side of the world. So I think those are things which people try to struggle to address. And especially because the Northeast is infested with lots of insurgencies and subnational movements. Often I found that many people from the Northeast cannot look beyond the small worlds that the communities have created for them. So this is one way of actually bringing the stories which are minute back there, and yet bringing in something which can help us look at beyond. Now, when they talk about literature, it is not just my book, but I want to also point out two books which have quite been interesting, and I've looked at, for instance, Malsaumi Jacobs' Zorami, which is about the insurgency period in Mizoram, and perhaps which is also referred to by them as the darkest period, because if I'm sure many of you would be aware that it was during this insurgency period in Mizoram that the Indian Air Force used, aircraft, air bombing was carried out, which is often not heard. So history is something which is very dicey for many people to digest. And at the same time, there is the other book called Bitter Wormwood by Istirin Kire. Now, of course, it deals a lot with Naga conflict and problems that arose. But the problem with Naga largely is not so much, I would say, with the outside, the Indian forces. We are battling a problem of internal conflicts, factionalism. And so in this book, what Istirin brings out beautifully is the Christian concept of forgiveness, how we need to move on, forgiving each other, not just forgiving India for the wrongs that they have committed, but also forgive each other so that there is a way to move forward. And I'm sure many of you who are following the conflict issues in the Northeast have seen how the Nagas are also trying their bit to carry on talking about reconciliation and other things. But what happened when we talk about literatures from the Northeast is that literatures from the Northeast are often stereotyped as a conflict literature. This is something which has been resisted by many writers. So I think it makes sense to actually look at them in terms of how they are also propounding peace, reconciliation, and conflict resolution. Satish, you are muted.
Yeah, Vinod, is there some thoughts that you would like to share with Vio? Of course, Vio has also been someone who has been mentored by you for long years, and so grateful that Vio, you are trying to bring out a history very creatively, right? Which wouldn't have otherwise been read and heard by people. Yeah, Vinod.
Just a point of clarification for you, and that is it a collection of short stories, or is it a single narrative?
This is a novel, so not a short.
I know. So is it one novel, not okay?
Yeah, one novel. But yes, we can also look at different narratives within that. But this is a novel.
Right. And how do we get copies of it?
I was telling Satish that it is not yet released, but it is available for pre-booking at the moment. The press has delayed delivery of the book, which is expected to come anytime now. So next week, we are planning for a launch, virtual launch, of course. And of course, now it is already available on Speaking Tiger website, the publisher's website. But they said
it's there in the chat box. It's there in the chat box.
Yeah. So Amazon, I don't know, in Sri Lanka and other places, I'm not sure how they will do it, but Amazon will also make it available in a day or two.
I'll look out for it. But thank you very much. It's a great initiative, Love to see more Christians writing novels.
Yes, Savitri. We would also open it up for others to ask questions. How is it?
Sanjayan has a question. Sanjayan, would you like to ask it to get that ball rolling? And the poll, can you all, for those of you who are still here, would you mind answering the questions on the poll? We just want ideas on how to go forward, and these are 2 ideas that came up. We want to see whether it's popular or not.
So just to save time, I don't think Sanjay needs to read the question because it's there. And yes, I mean, I share Sanjan's sort of, I suppose, unhappiness with language like capture the university. I avoid this sort of military language. But to give Malik the benefit of the doubt, it's a long time since I've read his book, but to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think he's using this language of capturing in the same way that the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 10 speaks of demolishing strongholds and taking captive every argument to Christ. So it is not about capturing the university in the sense of seizing positions of power in order to dominate the university as Christians, but rather taking captive those anti-God ideologies and thought styles and making them subservient to Christ in our thinking and writing. So it's more an intellectual captivity rather than a political captivity.
Is there anybody who would like to ask Vinod or even each other questions?
Sorry, Savitri, are you talking to me?
Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Azoni.
Anyone who has questions. We still have a few minutes. If anyone has questions.
No, I don't have any question as such. Yeah.
Shashank, do you have a question?
No, I don't have. That was raised by mistake. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
Savitri, this is Prabhu. Can I ask a question from Vinod?
Of course. So Prabhu is the deputy principal of the Colombo Theological Seminary and so shapes the whole academia there.
So my question is actually related a little bit to Sanjan's perhaps. And it's my experience has been that when Christians speak as Christians in the public arena, not just in, I'll switch on my video. I have been asked to switch on my video. So
it's
when
very dark, it's very dark.
Yes,
Prabhu.
it's I'm sure you want. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, when Christians speak as Christians in the public arena, I find that they are resisted as being assertive of some sort of colonial privilege that they still are assumed to enjoy. So in terms of countries like Sri Lanka and I guess India too, where the indigenous or the Hindu or Buddhist majority feel that they have still a long ways to go to reconquer their lost hegemonies. Christians are seen as minorities who over-assert themselves beyond their real, representative value, or that they are somehow agents of the West in some form or the other. how do we actually overcome that fear that we are an authentic voice in the and a valuable voice in the community?
Well, this is the post-independent, immediately post-independent church in Sri Lanka and India were paralyzed by this fear, I think arising out of a sense of guilt for some of the privileges that they enjoyed, especially the mainstream Protestant churches. And so there was a kind of a moratorium on public pronouncements as Christians, even public evangelism. But I think that day is past, because I think we have to recognize that that Christians today are not in positions of privilege or power, especially in India, where the vast majority of Christians come from tribal or low caste backgrounds, where they never really enjoyed any political or economic privileges under colonial power, and that often it was the Hindu elites who benefited most from British rule. It was the Hindu elites who demanded, for example, an English education, an education in Western science. And so I think as we begin to rethink our history and realize that, yes, okay, while there are things that we should be embarrassed about, there are also lots of things that we should not be embarrassed about. We shouldn't experience false guilt. One of the leading historians of Indian Christianity is someone called Robert Frickenberg, and he often speaks of the British Raj as being not a Christian Raj, but a Hindu Raj, because the Raj was leaning over backwards to appease and give privileges to Hindu elites, and was not at all willing to support any kind of Christian missionary endeavors. And so we need, as Christians, to recover that history, a more nuanced history, and point out, tell stories how it was often Christian missionaries, Christian local administrators, indigenous Christians who stood up not for their own privileges, but for the privileges of others, and even gave back to Buddhists and Hindus their own histories, translated ancient Buddhist and Hindu texts into modern languages, made them more available. So both the Hindu and Buddhist religious institutions and schools were set up often in imitation of Christian schools and Christian institutions, and owe much to Christian scholarship and Christian political action at the grassroots level, often defending native interests against colonial interests. So that's why I think someone like you has a role to play as a historian in unearthing some of that history and making, first of all, the church aware of that history, so that we know, how. Well, it encourages us not to be falsely defensive, and at the same time not to be arrogant in the way that we speak, to recognize our mistakes, recognize our sins, but there is no need to be silent in the face of this kind of false anti-Christian propaganda. I don't know, does that answer your question in some degree?
Yes, yes, certainly. Thank you.
History is so important, and in South Asia, as much as in the USA today, the question of who writes our national histories is the most important public question. I guess next to that question I asked about the future, what kind of society do we want? And that's where Christians should be involved in that whole process of history writing, because otherwise we just allow people to just tell lies about Christian history, marginalize Christians as outsiders, foreigners who didn't contribute anything to our society. That's happening in India, it's happening in Sri Lanka. I don't know about Nepal and Burma, but probably there as well.